Sup, everybody? Welcome to episode 2 of Taking Stonks with Geoff and Mikey. I'm Mikey.
Stocks. I'm Coach Geoff.
Stonks. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about longevity in esports communities, how to keep your game from dying, essentially.
Yeah, I guess that is the negative way to put it. I don't know. I have a really strong opinion about saying that a game is dead. I've always thought that discussion, sure, in some cases it's absolutely true. Like, there are some games you don't see people playing anymore.
Right.
But talking about it can't possibly help. I think that if you talk about whether a game is dead or not, you either have malicious intent and want the game to die, or you are not doing what's in the best interest of yourself and your community.
Yeah, you're feeding into the perception that something is, inherently
as
wrong
soon
with
as you
what's
hear
happening.
Name of game and dead in the same sentence, someone's going to draw the wrong conclusion, whether you meant it or not.
Right.
And so I am going to at least not mention anything about a game dying per se. I'm just going to talk about what should your goals be as a community, and what are some things that you'll want to accomplish if you want to achieve the kind of longevity that some games enjoy and others don't.
Right.
So with that pedantic quibble out of the way, one thing that I think we should start with, because this is really ground level and really basic, but it's the question: why do you want your community to last forever? Why would you want that? What are some goals that you have if you have that in mind? That sounds really obvious, but I think that'll lead us to some deeper questions.
Now, are you asking this? Are you asking this from a developer standpoint or from
That's
a
a very
community
good
member
question.
standpoint?
I say we start from community and then move to developer. Because
Okay.
let's start with what we can control, and then let's talk about what outside factors we might have a little bit of influence over that we might want to talk about as well.
Gotcha. Okay, makes sense.
So why do you think a player would want their community to continue indefinitely? Why do you want... why do you think some people want to be playing Super Smash Bros. Melee in their nursing homes when they get old?
I think it's good to think about the idea of, I've made friends through playing this game, and it's done a whole lot for me as a person in terms of my not only personal development, but obviously professional development, since right now talking about it is part of my job. So that experience for me has been, just an absolute positive in my life, and to put it in reverse, I can't think of a reason why I would want that to go away. I might not want to engage directly with it as much in certain times, just depending on, where I'm at in my life, how much stuff I've got going on. But I can't think of a reason why I wouldn't want that to be there for me as an option.
Mm-hmm. I think the friends in the community are a big part of it. And the thing is, I feel like a community, a group of friends, a community can collectively move on from one thing to the next. I think that's where I'm coming from here. So, for example, a lot of games have sequels. And if your primary motivation in that game continuing is just to keep that group of people together and keep that same environment, in that case, it can be acceptable for your individual game to go away, as long as everybody is actually transitioning onto the sequel,
Yeah.
So, Smash 4 was a community of people that largely just moved on to Ultimate.
Jump ship, right? Yeah.
And that's a situation where if it wasn't so much the game and it was the community, as I think it was for a lot of those players, I think that that's a healthy thing to move on to the sequel. That ties into our developer conversation as well, and what our relationship with them should be.
Right.
But I individually also think that I would want a community. I would want a community that sticks around because they're enthusiastic for the game. Um, I this is my melee speaking 100%. There's definitely a pro melee
Right.
bias here, no question about it. Um, but I stuck with melee first because I loved the game, and then because I loved the community. And I know it's different for other people, but I think that the love of the game itself, its depth, and the beauty of its mechanics, um, when you can bond with someone over that, you can create community with people that you don't even know yet. Um, I think that if I were to try and get a Smash 4 club together right now, I would have a really hard time doing that because there aren't as many people that are playing that anymore. And so I think that one of the reasons that I might want an individual game to last forever is so that there's always that draw that will always be pulling new people in rather
Right.
than having just, well, we're basically here for the culture and we'll move on to whatever it is next. Well, what if I don't like what's next, you know? What if I don't want to spend so much time learning what comes next that I I'm not really a part of the community anymore because I haven't learned the basics.
I do think there's something so anomalous about Melee in this space. Like, there is nothing like it. You know, I can't think of a single game where, I think there's kind of a sliding scale here, right? And for me, the sliding scale goes, if we're just talking about fighting games, it goes from like Marvel versus Capcom to Tekken, let's say. I think Marvel vs. Capcom is like sequel comes out and the whole series as a competitive game, again, hate to say dies, but like all of the legacy tournaments for it just like stopped having the game there. It essentially got replaced by Dragon Ball Fighters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of the community dropped Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which is not an old game, right? Let me look up when it came out.
That is pretty recent. I want to say like 2018.
2017. So late 2017. Late 2017. And the thing is that most of the esports titles that are, the big heavy hitters that you think of, aside from like Fortnite, Call of Duty, they all came out earlier than that, right? They all came out 2016 or earlier. And I'm talking about Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Obviously, that's an esport that has a legacy that goes back, like, really far.
Even Fortnite is 2017.
Right, yeah. And Fortnite is around the same time, you know? And, like, it's just in the blink of an eye almost in terms of esports, like, just been dropped from everything that mattered to it. So that, I think, is the most, like, catastrophic contemporary example that we have for a sequel coming out and your game just, losing all of its vitality, essentially. Then you have Street Fighter. Well, actually, I'd put Melee obviously before Street Fighter because it's not only that you don't like the new games, it's that you like them so much less than the old game that you just continue to play the old game. Which I think is kind of unprecedented. I can't think of another esports title where that is the case, where like you could make an argument for a long time that Melee was actually bigger than the current game.
I would argue that until Smash 4 came out, it was 100% bigger. Like there was maybe the month or two after Brawl came out, and then after that point, I think Melee was just a bigger community at that point.
It's like a 6 or 7 year period where the old game is more popular than the new game, and it's not like Melee is going away anytime soon. People will talk about like the diminished numbers, but it's not like it's withering with not being able to attract people for major tournaments. Like you can still get 1,000 people at a Melee tournament.
It doesn't have the downward momentum that a lot of titles that quote unquote die have.
Like Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite,
like
right?
Fewer people can play Melee, and it will not deter people from playing Melee.
Yeah.
I look at the example, especially of Street Fighter, between Street Fighter 4 and Street Fighter 5, and I think, like, man, I feel for those people, because Street Fighter 4, that was a game that had a competitive life ahead of it. People were still playing it. And then as soon as Street Fighter 5 comes out, everyone switches, but people didn't like Street Fighter 5 as much. Mechanically speaking, I believe it was very defensive focused. It just got kind of campy and lame. And a lot of, top players were very vocal about it, but they kept playing the game. And
right.
So this will kind of come back up when we talk about grassroots versus esports mentality, and what we'll define what those terms mean in a second, I'm sure. But my thesis here is there not a time and place where, even with a title with a lot of developer support like Street Fighter, where the players should insist on playing the version of the game they like rather than the version that's out? I think that there's a lot that goes into that decision. I think that Melee is very anomalous. I think that, it's a pretty extreme choice to make. But in terms of the competitive lifespan of the esport, if that's what you care about, that it might be a step that you want to consider.
Right.
So, we've talked about the next bullet point without me having to even bring it up. Haha. I'm so good at outlining things. One thing that I think is an important metric that we've already kind of referred to a couple of times is the number of players who are actively playing the game. That is, they're the ones who are showing up to tournaments on a regular basis. They're the ones who are your viewers, your content audience. They're, everything, the lifeblood of the community. I think that it's the most important metric in terms of with how well your game is doing is not necessarily the number of players, the sheer number of players, but I would say it's the growth of that number of players. I would say, like, if your numbers are increasing over time, that can never be a bad thing. That's never a bad sign.
Sure.
And that it's once those numbers start decreasing, that's when the game might be having problems. It might be heading towards some unfortunate event. Because, and this will also come up when we get into grassroots versus esports. Maybe we should have that conversation earlier than I planned for it. But I think that you can get a really big spike in the number of players in that player base if you have a decent game and a lot of money to throw at it. But keeping those people there is the hard part, I think. I think a lot of games with heavy developer support will end up having a pretty big spike and being in the limelight, being reported on by the media and everything, get some really good shows out there, and then just kind of go away.
Yeah.
And I think as a competitor, like purely from my own consumer perspective, that's not what I would want in my game. We want our game to last forever. That's not what we're looking for. And so I would say that the measure we should really be thinking about is not what is the sheer number of people, but what's the growth and what's the increase, decrease.
Right. And I think another, aside from sequels, another thing that can come into play in that regard is patches.
That's definitely true.
Because, a lot of these titles, they're not... So, like, League, CSGO, Dota 2, Hearthstone, Overwatch... I don't think there are necessarily going to be sequels for those games. I think those are just going to be, like... We're updating this over time to keep it fresh, like release DLC and to balance things. And that's another reason why Melee is so, like... is so weird in this space. It's almost like a case study for what happens if you just let it ride. You know, it's like the only one of these games that's not going to change at all, barring like some Melee HD thing happening, which
I hope it doesn't.
I hope it doesn't either. And we can talk about why that is exactly. But I think that something that hasn't really been floated out by those big esports is like, what if we just let things develop? There are still things that are being discovered in Melee. Like, they're small, right? They're situational. But things even on the level of being able to SDI out of like Fox's drill, defensive options like that, I think if you give those sorts of things time to develop in these other games, they could be enough to like mitigate the effect of things that have been patched because people viewed them as being overpowered.
I do also think that Melee is anomalous in that there are so many of those kinds of mechanics.
That's true.
Because I look at like League of Legends, you just don't have so much control over your movements that you could find something new in Riven's kit 10 years after she's released, you know?
Yeah. But do
I
you
feel
think
like that Champions... Go ahead.
Do you think it's possible, and we've even seen this in Melee, do you think it's possible that by like nerfing a character, you are essentially taking someone's livelihood away? Do you think that has happened in one of these games before?
So there was definitely a complaint in League of Legends that the game was changing too rapidly. I think it was Doublelift who was very vocal about this, and since the media is at Doublelift's beck and call because he's such a character,
right?
That it got a lot of publicity. But there's something to it for sure. I think with a game like League of Legends, that's a game where there are over 100 characters that you can play.
Yeah.
And multiple roles that you can flex into. Like, a player in that game might be called on to play a different role than they main on a team. Like, you see all the time where they'll just start playing different positions. Imagine you took Messi and told him he had to be a goalie.
Yeah.
Like, that's the kind of thing that happens in a MOBA. And at the end of the day, the players who are adaptable, who are capable of learning and have learned good mechanics on one champion can usually carry that over to others. But there are such thing as one tricks. There are people who are just supremely skilled on one character, and they don't get a lot of opportunities in the space in general. So it is definitely possible that we destroyed some solo queue monster by doing something like that. Like, I know Hacks, for example, in the Melee community, was also a Diamond 1 Twisted Fate player for a really long time, and he literally locks for Twisted Fate every single game. I don't know, like, at some point you would expect someone sees his name and just bans Twisted Fate, right? Then what do you do?
Right.
But, like, so yes and no. There are definitely... I think what's more damning is if a style of play loses its viability.
Yeah.
If, like, okay, well, you nerfed this one 80 carry, but I can move to this other 80 carry. Okay, that's one thing. But if you've changed the game in such a way that the 80 carry role is no longer really impactful, and your team was relying on you to carry, now you've got a problem as a team.
Right.
And that's something that can have more of an impact. Obviously, balancing a game is absurdly difficult. I usually find, in my experience, that once a dev team has a few years of experience, generally their patches will do more good than harm as time goes on.
And I think there's also a question of, like, did this deserve to get people where they are in the first place? And I think that can be seen in the case of, like, the transition from Smash 4 to Ultimate for Bayonetta players. Like, a bunch of Bayonetta players have kind of dropped off of the face of top-level competition because they're no longer able to play the character in the same way. And you can argue, I guess, that that's a good thing, and that Bayonetta was so overpowered in Smash 4 that those players didn't deserve to be top players in the first place. But
I feel like anyone who gets to a top level in a game, like, I couldn't just pick up Bayonetta right now and be a top Smash 4 player, right?
Yeah, because there were, like, I mean, there were a bunch of...
It's not going to make me better, even.
Because you look at, like, 2017 EVO Grand Finals, or was it 2018?
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, it was 2018.
You got the two Bayonettas just charging their move for
Captain
2 minutes.
Captain Zack and Lima, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there were a bunch of Bayonettas who didn't make it to that point in bracket. You know, there were a ton of Bayonetta players who went 0-2 at that tournament, I'm sure. So, you know, even with the best character in the game, there's still something to be said for, like, you made it, you know? You made it to the summit.
I think that a lot of the pushback against a situation like that will come from someone who is playing not to have to lose rather than to try and improve as a player.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely a lot of negative mindset that gets pointed at characters in situations like that. Do I think it was better for the competitive health of the game that Bayonetta was not as dominant? Let's bring it back even further. Do I think it was better for the health of the video game that Meta Knight was nerfed from Brawl? Yes.
Yeah, and I think, interestingly, it seems like most Meta Knight players who were top players in Brawl, like, moved on to Smash 4 and did pretty well. You know? With the exception of maybe Mewtwo King, who was, for a while, considered the best Brawl player and never really reached that summit in Smash 4. But you look at Nairo, Ally... Well, Ally played Snake in Brawl, but, like, Nairo, Zero, those guys, you know, again, reached the top level in Smash 4. And I wonder if that just has to do with how, you know, good those guys are at Smash, or how Meta Knight maybe prepared them more to play other characters than Bayonetta
I think one
did.
thing to be said in that particular game might be that Brawl was a very neutral game-heavy game.
Yeah.
Whereas in Melee, there are sometimes strings that you can put together, and in 64, I mean, you get one touch and they might just die.
Yeah.
In Brawl, you know, it was very floaty. There wasn't a lot of follow-up on your attacks, and so as soon as you did something, you had to be able to do it again. And Meta Knight gave you a lot of tools to make that happen, but you still have to have the brain power to wield him.
And Bayonetta is very much not a character like that. Bayonetta was the combo-heavy character in Smash 4, right? It's like you push a button and then you carry your opponent to the ceiling and it's over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that might account for a difference there, but the point that we're getting to is simply that of what role should patches play if you want your game to last.
Yeah.
I think Riot Games, we have to look at them because they're such a juggernaut in the esports scene, and their philosophy is going to dictate a lot of what other people try to do. And they seem very clearly to have decided that the best path for them is to very consistently, rigorously be making new content. To always be like every month a new champion or something like that. It's a very regular drumbeat. You can pretty much predict to within a couple of days when the next champion is going to come out because they just do it so frequently. New champions, new artwork, new items, new gameplay tweaks. You know, you come into that game 2 seasons later after having not played it for a while, and so many things are different. The pathing that you need to take through the jungle is different. The items everyone is building are different. The champions that are high tier are different. I've seen characters like Graves be viable and then not be viable at all, and then all of a sudden come back but in a completely different role. Now he's a jungler. Like, it's just so... It's always in flux. And I think about that a lot because I wonder, is that good for the game? It's definitely going to bring new people in to have the production value that they have. But as we'll talk about later on, that's not actually financially profitable. Um, and that doesn't mean I think it's wrong, because I think it's a very good thing that they do. I just wonder what the financial consequences are of that in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so before we get too far into developer stuff, let's talk about a few things that's because it looks like that's where the conversation is trending right now. And there is one more topic that I want to talk about before we get there, which is um, what standards do we, the people that we control that are not related to the game itself, what standards do we need to set for ourselves before a game can potentially take off? Because we can talk about all we want about how a developer killed the community, but the community can absolutely kill itself, I think.
Right.
And so I just wanted to go through all of the roles. I've broken it down to organizers, players, commentators, and then content creators. Commentators, broadcasters, I guess, we can be a little bit more broad because there's the streamer and there are other roles involved in all of that production. But is there any group of people you think I missed there, or do you think that's a good place to start?
No, I think that makes sense. I think that's fine.
So let's start with players, since that encompasses the largest group of people. I'm sure everybody involved there is to some extent a player, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're like the organizer at a major and you came there for a different game, but you have to run another one, and it's like, whatever, I'm going to run this. But players.
Well, we do take that for granted, I think, in the Melee community. I think we do take for granted that most of the people who are a part of the stuff that we're doing are actually players of the game and are there because they enjoy the game. I'm not sure how true that is in other communities.
I think, because like literally just, I think yesterday I ran an NHL 20 tournament.
Yeah.
I've never played that game in my life.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I was a player of an esport, and the reason that I got into doing what I do and the reason that I have the skills I have is that I cared enough about that esport that I wanted to develop those skills.
Yeah.
There are very few organizations, I think, that don't at least love the idea of esports when they get into it. It doesn't seem profitable enough to me for someone to have a pure profit motive for running these events.
Yeah.
If you do, I don't think that's smart as a business person. Now, I think there have been organizations that are like that. I have no idea why, for example. I'm not going to get into specifics. There are a couple of groups in mind where I look at them and I'm like, why was this the place you decided to go into business? But anyway, well, that's another stream. That's my private Twitter that I don't have. That's
right.
That's the T-Sys. Anyway, players. Let's talk about what do our players need to be like and do, or not do, in order to keep the community healthy.
Yeah.
So, to start with, the thing that I found most important when I was doing direct event organizing, like when I was the TO of a weekly event, was I felt like the players needed to create a space that felt welcoming to each other.
Yeah.
They needed to be good enough as human beings. They needed to stray away from degenerate tendencies enough that somebody who they didn't know could come into their space and feel like they belonged, feel like they were not alienated, feel like even if they weren't good at the game, that they could still exist there and be welcomed.
Yeah.
That encompasses a lot of things, being welcoming. It's not just, oh, we've got to be friendly, cool. Like it's easy to write off in your mind, but there are a lot of implications of that. If your community tolerates bad behavior, like trash talking each other, like threatening each other, like physical violence. Like, I don't care how manly it was when you asked the dude to step outside. That's something that's putting someone off. Things like accusations of, sexual misconduct need to be taken seriously. There are a lot of things that need to be done because there are groups of people who are going to feel vulnerable stepping into that space if you just let it all hang out.
Yeah.
And there are people who will call me an SJW for that stance, but in my experience, the only way you're going to get diversity is if you create a space where you're allowing everybody to exist and not just some people to comfortably exist.
And I think even aside from the principle of that, which should stand enough on its own that it should be motivating for people to do, I think it's pragmatic to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that...
I completely agree.
Yeah, I think that allowing people who drive other people away into your space as a gaming community will do just that. It will drive a bulk of the people away, because most people are on the side of being made uncomfortable by that sort of thing, and not on the inside of a gaming community that relishes in its own inner culture of exclusionary, toxic, whatever you want to call it, sort of behavior. So I think that allowing that behavior in the long term is going to drive away more people than it makes feel included.
This brings us back to that metric that, if the net number of players is decreasing as a result of what's going on, that's hurting the health of your community.
Right.
And I think the thing that's hard to understand for a lot of people, because I only saw this myself as an organizer over a long period of time, you're not going to notice when you turn someone away. There's a really strong vocal minority bias in esports communities, where the people who you hear the most are the people who are going to be coming back regardless.
Yeah.
The people who feel empowered enough to speak out and feel like they have a voice and feel like they can influence things, they're not going to go away. You're not going to drive them away unless something relatively extreme happens, or if they're the extreme thing that needs to be pushed away.
Right.
So there are so many people who are invisible from point A to point B, in and out of the community. There's so many people who will be on the periphery of it, not really see what it's about, not really get involved in it, not even necessarily learn the game, and who will already decide, okay, that checks this box, it's not for me, I'm gone.
Yeah. I think even as a person who has not been affected just in my life very much at all by the sort of behavior that would drive someone away, I think there is a point where I would just dip out. As much as I enjoy it as it stands now, and as much as I was enthusiastic about being involved in that community when I first got started, there's a tipping point for me. Even as someone who has very little skin in the game with stuff like that, so I can only imagine how many people are driven away in the way that you're talking about. They just see something and they are done with it. They're not going to deal with that sort of behavior.
I think another thing that people fail to realize is how things have different levels of impact on different people. It all boils down to empathy at the end of the day, but like, empathy is based on a knowledge of another person, and some people just have not had the life experience to develop this knowledge. You get into esports usually at a fairly early age. You're starting to put out your feelers in your school years, and a lot of the time, kids don't have just not seen or experienced people in such a way that they know what's really going on in their heads. But like, you think about women in an esports community, for instance, always across the board an underrepresented group. The best I personally have seen is the Splatoon 2 community. I'm told that Dead by Daylight has a really, really strong presence of women in the community. But even in those communities that are kind of the gold standard, I would say at best it's maybe between 1 in 8 and 1 in 4. 51% of the population is female. What the hell is going on, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of people make the I think bad faith argument that, oh well, women just need thicker skin about this, but you start to develop that sort of mindset that, like, oh well, if they can't hang in this community, then why should they be in this community? That's I think something that is, again, just going to decrease the number of players in your community, and as such, for pragmatic reasons, you need to cut that out. And so you take, like, if you go and actually look at, say, the experiences of some of the extremely brave, I must say, women who are putting out there, here are the things that I'm experiencing online. Here are the things people are sending me over NetPlay. Here, you'll see that it's a different experience that those people have.
Yeah.
And if those very brave, very outspoken, angry women had not put that out there for us all to see, you as an organizer, me personally, that would be completely invisible to me, because it's not a loud vocal minority that's a part of the community and feels like it has a voice. It's a group of people who will dip the toe in the lightest way possible in the pool, barely create a ripple, and then dash out the door before you have a chance to talk to them. And they'll just be invisible. You won't see those voices. You have to be proactive about courting new audiences. You have to be proactive about making the scene more inclusive.
Right.
And so I think that, this now comes down to organizers. And I think we can start moving towards that idea. Because the organizers, they're the people who really have a more of an ability to enforce these standards. The players, obviously, they can become organizers. I was a player first and then became an organizer basically by accident.
Most people are.
Mm-hmm. So it's just like a very enthusiastic player becomes an organizer, and so I think this is a natural progression that we move from player to organizer. But when you make that move, you now have to realize that you have the ability to design the spaces, the social spaces you create for these people. You have the ability to structure the interactions between them. And you have to realize that even things like the bracket format you choose can have a drastic impact on how that culture develops.
Yeah, absolutely. Something as simple as making sure that you have enough setups for people to play on, and that people aren't just standing around with nothing to do.
Yeah. I, for example, in my events, always tried to put a premium on how can I get people playing as much as possible, and how can I get people outside of their comfort zone? How can I get people playing with people that they wouldn't normally play with? We used to do things like playing doubles matches where the top player was paired with the bottom seed, and you just worked your way inward from there, because that created relationships between the strongest players and the weakest players. It created an incentive for the strongest players to help the weakest players out. Those were the kinds of side events and things that I tried to run. Obviously, keeping things fresh and trying to give people a different experience each time. That was a goal of mine, just to keep people coming back. But it was also certainly designed in part so that you tried to develop a mentor relationship between top players and lower level players, because that's the sort of thing that keeps them coming back. I came into the scene and immediately I was friends with Ty. I got introduced very quickly to Taj and Wobbles and Axe, and like all of those players, newbie by name, were invested in my improvement. Like, with an all-star cast like that, how am I not going to become an organizer? How am I going to not want to give back to the scene?
Yeah.
If you can establish those connections in some way, you've succeeded as an organizer, I think. And that's the sort of thing that, you don't see as much of, say, Taj anymore in the scene. But his work in the scene was still influential in keeping the scene alive. I try to carry on the legacy of things that he taught me, and Ty does as well, and all of these other people look up to him and value what he did for us. So as a player, you can impact the organizers and vice versa. It's all a community effort at the end, but we're making these divisions to kind of give an idea of what everyone can do about it.
Right.
What do you think on the broadcasting and content creation side? Because I think you have a lot more experience in that regard, having been a commentator at nationals, having worked with some of the higher end groups. What's something that you think they can do to establish higher community standards?
I think that the Crimson Blur put this in a very sort of simple but eloquent way, which is that if you give Melee a stage, it will always deliver. Like 100% of the time. And I think part of that, in large part, at least for me, as someone who watches broadcasts, is because of people like Scar and Toph. People who tell great stories about the games, people who take you with them in the moment, and have this just like brimming enthusiasm and talk about the game in a way that makes you excited about it. And I think that kind of, it is an intangible factor, right? Like if you talk about the core elements to having an esports community that lasts for a really long time, I think the intangible element of it is making a game that people love, right? I think that's the hard part. That really is the most difficult part about it. All of this stuff there's a blueprint for, aside from that, really. And I think at their best, commentators and content creators are capturing that spirit and delivering it to people. And it's not just the fact that Melee has good people working in it, has a community of players who are enthusiastic about it, has lab monsters who have been discovering things about the game that are absolutely insane and mind-boggling.
Maybe that's something we should add, the lab monsters.
The lab monsters, yeah, that's huge. And we love that. But would people know about the lab monsters if Toph wasn't talking about it on the mic? If there weren't people to be stoked on the work that the lab monsters were doing? Probably not. So yeah. I think that commentators and content creators are largely responsible for conveying the story of the game that we all love and showing the tangible work that people do in a light that makes other people excited by that work and by the game itself.
That's really good input on that. It makes me think of it in a different way too. Because there was a conversation that I was having on Twitter the other day about Splatoon commentary. Because there are some phenomenal Splatoon commentators. Like, if Nintendo is hiring you, I'm talking about Nine, I'm talking about Milana here.
Yeah.
If Nintendo is hiring you, you're doing something right.
Right.
And Eric was also phanomenal. K-Bot is phenomenal when he gets a chance to put down his TOing mic and pick up his commentary mic.
Right.
There are so many good names in that community. But it also gets a lot of flack for lower level commentators. There's also a lot of criticism put towards them and usually the criticism that you get from them is not there are usually two. The less important one, the more secondary one, is usually, these players aren't really knowledgeable about the game.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's leveled at every commentator ever.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think there's a single commentator who has not been told that at some point in time.
The only one's probably Drugged Fox that I can think of.
Yeah, if you're criticizing Drugged Fox, you'd better be... I don't even know who you'd better be. Like,
right, yeah.
Who Plup, maybe? I don't even know.
I don't know.
Anyway, so he's an anomalous case. Like, man's a genius and has the respect of everybody. But
he's nuts.
the vast majority of people are going to be criticized. If you're spending your time at that tournament, let's put it this way, if you're spending your time at that tournament commentating instead of playing really hard to become a top player, like, like a commentator necessarily has to do in order to commentate,
Yeah.
you're going to get a little bit less experience that way. And that can make a difference for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
The job of organizing, the job of commentating does take away from some of that time that you would normally have to practice. So I think that is sort of a necessary sacrifice in some places, but the more important complaint that you always hear besides they're not knowledgeable is always they don't seem interested. It's not that they are boring me, it's that they are not interested and therefore they're not making me feel interested.
Right, yeah.
If that's the most common complaint, then it's antithesis. These people make me excited to play the game. That's really what the goal is. And that ties back to our goal. Are you, by your actions, increasing the number of people who play this game?
Yeah, definitely.
And I imagine the same goes for content creators too. Like you look at, say, AlphaRad, top ultimate content creator, and his basic motivation for building all of that content is just, I wanted to play games with some friends, and I thought it was fun, and I thought some other people would like watching. That's kind of what it all boils down to for him.
Yeah.
And a lot of his following just kind of came from that. That's a perfect way to do content creation. People get caught up a lot, I think, on experts sharing their opinions to get you better at the game. Let's make you improve. You get a lot of content like that from, say, that SRB2 dude from Splatoon. You get a lot of that kind of content from, say, hacks in Smash Melee. But I think at the end of the day, the enthusiasm still has to come through in order for that to be a viable option. I think that the first and most important piece of any content creation is bringing other people into the community.
I think there's a reason why, like, John Boyce is the most, well, maybe not the most, but like one of the most popular sports content creators right now, and it's because people like to hear the story.
Mm-hmm.
His stuff is very stats driven. Actually, if you look at the core of what it is, that's Chart Party is the name of one of the shows.
Right. It's way more stats than anything else.
Yeah, but like, he's just so compelling in the way that he like weaves those stats into a narrative. It's if you haven't seen John Boyce, I think even if you're not a sports fan, you're an esports fan, you should check it out. It's
go watch 222 to 0.
Yeah,
it's a surrealist masterpiece. I love it.
Yeah. Tons of great stuff.
Yeah, he takes statistics and makes a story out of them. I mean, I think that people definitely need to understand that that's possible. I think there are a lot of like political perspectives that are uninformed by that, and that scares me. But
right.
Going back to the esports concept here, content, I think, is all about community building. It is you're using the internet as outreach to find people who might be interested, people who are peripherally interested, and get them to interested in joining an esports event.
Yeah. And I think that really is, that's where it starts for like everyone, pretty
mm-hmm.
much. Everyone's like first step in joining an esports community is probably a YouTube search, or something mm-hmm. like that.
I got started back in 2005 when my friends found a set of Ken versus Azen doing Marth Dittos on FD. I think it was 5 stocks. I don't think they had the official rule set nailed down yet even.
Yeah.
But they found that video because we had been playing the game and casually, but we're not going to develop an esports scene out of just us there. I developed into the esports scene while my friends didn't, because I found that one YouTube video and I was like, I'm pretty good amongst all of my friends. I want to go and try and become better. I want to go and show off at a tournament. And then I went and got bodied and was like, oh.
Yeah. I see.
Bigger.
I see this. Which I guess in a way that leads back to the grassroots versus esports way of doing things. Because mm-hmm. I don't think that opportunity exists as concretely in a lot of the top-down esports that exist. Would you agree? Do you think that like the link is as strong in those games as it is in, say, Smash, where you can watch a YouTube video and then get immersed in the competitive community?
I do think my biggest point of reference for this is League of Legends. Um, League of Legends, I really started off hearing about the game from friends.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't have the same experience. Um, Part of it was that, because they have the marketing budget to throw behind it, they're able to create buzz. And that buzz,
Yeah.
I think, was probably what's got me sold on the game. Sold. I've still never paid a cent to them for it. But it is a free game for perspective of those who don't have it. Like, it's free to play. It's not pay to win. All you can buy are skins. So I've resisted that pull for 7 seasons. Anyway,
right.
The thing though that makes me think that it could still be possible is that what was that guy's tag? So there were a bunch of YouTubers. Donkey was not the first that I found. I think I found him through someone that he would claim was his imitator. But I found a bunch of YouTubers. Nowadays, there's still like Lily Pichu. There's Magikarp Used Fly. There's a bunch of people who are really big in streaming and content creation spaces that are still playing League of Legends. You still see Pokimane playing it to this day. And I think that those people, again, their content is not super game focused.
Yeah.
The game is the medium through which they're interacting with their friends. And you're basically sitting in on a more real reality TV show by watching them play together. You're watching them crack jokes and be, improv comedians together in the game. But you see that and you go, I want that experience for myself, and you pick up the game. And that's kind of how I was with League of Legends at first. Like, I wanted to learn League of Legends specifically because I was going to college in a state that I didn't live in, and I wanted to be able to make friends quickly. And having 4 teammates on my team who would depend on me in a competitive context felt like a great way to be able to make some friends. And it didn't end up working out that way, but that was what got me into the game, and I'm still here 7 seasons later,
Right.
So parsing out, what of that was grassroots and what of that was esports, the game being more ubiquitous, at least at first, was something that was definitely straight up esports. Like, when I got into Melee, I had to drive 45 minutes away to a community college where there were, I think, 12 people in the bracket. And like the 25 was, I think, the most that ever happened at that tournament. I had to drive so far away. It's the situation that worries parents. Like, I remember the story that Ty tells about his first Melee tournament where he took a 4-hour bus ride, and then he, the 14-year-old, is hanging out with a bunch of 20 somethings. And
yep.
They talked about it later. Like, why did your parents let you do that? So that kind of first experience in a competitive setting with the game is way different, I think, between a grassroots and an esports mentality. Just so we're clear, I mean, grassroots is a word that I'm sure people know, but esports, when we say that in this context, grassroots versus esports as a dichotomy, we're referring to esports being a game that has a lot of developer support and is largely pushed and maintained as a competitive scene by the developer. If it's a grassroots scene, that means that the developer is not providing the competitive infrastructure. They're not the ones running the tournaments. They're not the ones providing the organizers of the competitive rule sets. They're not the ones hiring the talent. It's just that a community that is passionate about the game has arisen around that, and they want to push the game themselves. And the lines get blurred a little bit. I think that, while Melee is quintessential grassroots, I think, that just the minimum amount of developer support that I've ever seen for a competitive game. You also get, say, like an indie developer where, sure, they might be in full support and putting their whole life behind developing that game's esports scene, but they're just not as well off as Riot Games or Blizzard, who are, you know, getting money from Tencent, um, who can push professional marketing budgets, who can buy literally the best animators on the damn planet to put together the League of Legends cinematics. Like, God, those are so good. And like, how is Skullgirls going to do that? how is anybody going to put together that strong of an advertisement? How is anyone going to develop the LCS for an indie game? You just can't do that. So that's where the distinction comes from. Usually it's very clear to see which game falls in which category, even though it is a spectrum.
Yeah, and I think, again, Melee is an anomaly in that your experience of having like 4 of maybe the top 200 Melee players of all time at your disposal is incredibly unique to that sort of community. I wonder what it would take for a game with developer support to encourage their figureheads like that to just go to like a local LAN tournament, you know? Mm-hmm. to be there for something like that.
It's one of the paradoxes of the growth of the community, and this is one thing that makes me hesitate to use the metric of are you increasing in number as you go, because on the one hand, I definitely think that even a community like Melee, even those dark ages that were where the community was so small, I think they could have easily doubled the number of players that were there if the community had been more inclusive. But it does get to a point where if your community grows enough, your players start to become celebrities, your top players. Back when, you know, I was getting into it, you could just sit down with Kells, with Dart, with Axe, with, you know, these are all people that I played with back when I was an absolute scrub, when I was a nobody, because I was somebody just by being there. There were just not enough people. They had to value every single person, and they had to foster the tiny bit of engagement that they did have so that they wouldn't lose it. I think that having a small community like that really incentivizes top players to invest in the lower level players. And that was something that I thought was beautiful about it. That, you know, those early days of the ASU weeklies where Wobbles would just sit down and talk mindset, talk mentality with people, and help them become better people. That was one of the most beautiful things I've ever fostered. But that was in a room with 10 people tops. As soon as you get 100 people, it's not a therapy session anymore. You know, you've got too many people in the room. Like, this is a crowd event, and there's definitely some momentum to that. Like, you go to Evo and you stand in the crowd there. Whew, you can't describe it except that you get this mob mentality, but the mob mentality is positive. The mob mentality is driving you towards enjoying something harder than you've ever enjoyed it before. It's so cool and so powerful. But if that's all you have, if you don't have the foundation that establishes that love in a healthy context in the beginning, like I think that Melee benefited from starting small and then getting big.
And the thing is that it didn't even start small, right? Like, because it was so... Smash is almost like League of Legends in that it is ubiquitous, but it's ubiquitous because people play it.
I feel like it's ubiquitous casually for sure.
Right.
I feel like at a competitive level, you know, that is a good point.
That's the thing, right? Like, I think in order for something to be, you know, because people will talk about esports and its potential to be as popular as like football, you know, they'll jump to that comparison, you know, in venture capital meetings, I'm sure, like all the time, they'll talk about it. That doesn't happen unless a game is very widely played by people in their homes with their friends. You know, I don't think it can happen unless that is the case. Unless it's like you going over to your friend's house to play basketball with them in their front yard.
Yeah.
And
I think something that sports have definitely gotten right that esports haven't yet is, and this is largely why we're stepping into the business that we are. It's that entry to the higher level competition.
Yeah.
Esports has always been focused on the top players, on the elite, on the LCS teams, on the RLCS teams, on the top players in Smash, their personalities. But there's so much less thought that is put into the infrastructure at the lower levels of play. Baseball has Little League. They've had that for so long. It's the way that you get into baseball.
Yeah. And I guess
recreational soccer leagues, recreational basketball leagues, YMCAs.
And I guess that would bring us to the point of like, why would developers be interested in that? Like, why are developers interested in creating an esports community for their game? And in being involved in stuff like that. What does it get for them?
So, obviously, the goal for them, from a business perspective, is to sell more product. I say that, but then I second guess it, because I think about how Riot Games doesn't turn a profit. But they're, rather than saying, oh, we're not being profitable, rather than saying we're not being profitable, they turn around and get A-list musicians and A-list animators to put together these beautiful cinematics that they put out. They go and create the highest production value viewing experience for their games. They sell out soccer stadiums. They do things that make it seem like they have more money to throw behind it than they do. And I have to wonder, is that sort of that grassroots spirit of we just want our game to be cool rather than we want to make money off our game? That's something that gives me a little bit of hope. There are a lot of things about Riot Games that do not give me a lot of hope, but that's one of the things that does make me feel a little bit better about it. I also think about there was a really quick video clip I saw once of the I think it was a guy who worked for Tempo Storm ? No, it was CLG. It was CLG.
Mm-hmm.
Someone was asking him, "Hey, why do you guys have melee players?" And he goes, and they're like, "You can't be profiting off of that, right? That's not an investment that's paying off, is it?" And he goes, "Nah, it's not, but they're cool to have." That was basically his thought about it. I think that at a certain point, if you get big enough, if you have enough money to throw at it, maybe you do stop caring about the money itself and you start caring about, can I make something cool with this money that I am now making? Can I reinvest this? Can I get the experience going in some cyclical, healthy fashion that will help the game survive forever, or at least create something cool while it's still here?
Right.
So that's something that's in the back of my head. But
yeah, I do think it's kind of tenuous to rely on companies to do that. But I think there is something to be said for hosting tournaments. I think there's sort of a resistance from, I don't know. It's almost like big developers think that grassroots tournaments are too small for them to be involved in, and maybe there is a space for people like us to come in and fill in those gaps, But what's wrong with having a tournament in a hotel ballroom? What's wrong with having a tournament in a gym? There are a lot of ways that you can be reaching out to people and putting marketing effort behind things that are going on a ground level that maybe that's too small for for those companies to be reaching into, but I think there is room for growth in those spaces. And, you know, ultimately, I think that will only help the top level. Like, I don't know. Like, to me, as somebody who's, like, never really played League of Legends before, I have, like, very little desire to watch it. You know? I, I, it's like somebody who knows nothing about baseball has very little desire to watch a baseball game. And I think part of that is incumbent upon the sport to be reaching out to those people and making that sort of thing known. And baseball has a huge problem in that its average fan is just getting increasingly older. Young people are not getting into baseball because they're not being reached out to. And it's a pretty hard to understand game that is very complicated. There's a lot of things to keep track of.
Requires a very specific field and resources to play.
Yes, yeah. And the rules are not easy to understand at first. And I think some esports are also going to run into that problem. Like, they aren't necessarily reaching out into... They're grasping at, like, a limited amount of players, I feel. They're not reaching out into spaces to educate people about their game and to get them involved in grassroots ways to bring them up sort of to the level where they're interested in the competitive aspect of those games on a high level.
I think about, like, on the one hand, you know, through so many indirect ways, yes, the tournaments are increasing attendance and everything. It seems like it would be so hard to convince a marketing team, let's say, that there's enough ROI, enough return on investment there, that it would be worthwhile for them to pick any one individual event. Like,
yeah,
what happens if we book this hotel ballroom and only 50 people show up?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that the more I think about it, the more this sounds like top level organizations partnering with lower level organizations. So, like, if you look at sort of the little league analog in basketball, it's like the junior NBA essentially, which is run through YMCAs. YMCAs are the venue, and they are the organizing body, if you will, behind the junior NBA, but the NBA puts its name on it as marketing. Like, it will give you a Junior Suns jersey. I have Junior Suns jerseys from when I was in middle school.
That's sick.
So that sort of outreach, I think, is what I'm talking about. So, like, Nintendo, for example, will see, like, the very biggest Smash tournaments, and they will do whatever sort of backroom deal happens, and they'll have their logo on the stream. But Nintendo is not providing any support for where they could actually be reaching new people, right? If you're watching Genesis, you might be watching it as your first time watching a Smash event. But chances are this is just the biggest event for people who are already part of the Smash community to congregate around and watch.
I do think that with the very biggest tournaments, there is actually a lot of new viewership there. Like, I think about EVO. Like, a lot of people get into a game from watching it at EVO.
I think that EVO is different in that it's like a multi-game thing, right? So you might get some crossover in terms of people watching it for Street Fighter, having known it as a fighting game community tournament, and they'll, see Smash and be interested in it. Maybe that's not necessarily true for Melee, because there's not a whole lot of crossover between Melee and the rest of the FGC.
What we can definitely say is that there isn't really a lower level league or anything like that on a scale large enough that
it's
Nintendo's just going to advertise that.
It's not cohesive, right? And
There's
could
so
have
much
been
interest. There's so much demand
it could have been with the Smash World Tour, right? Like, finally somebody took the leap and put up prize money for a circuit-type organization of events. And then we have coronavirus, of course, so we'll never really know how that panned out. But...
How that pandemic'd out.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. But it could happen on, like, an institutional level. And maybe this is a bit self-serving as talking as a representative of a business who is running esports events, but something like the partnership between the YMCA and the Junior Sons, where it's like, hey, we like the work that you're doing. We're going to put some marketing dollars behind that because we feel it will help the top level of our competition. It will get more people interested in the NBA by virtue of reaching out into these youth sports leagues.
Yeah, I think it's the long term that a lot of the game devs don't really go for that causes the game to peter out.
Yeah.
It might be that they see, oh, these other games, their lifespan usually is X number of years, and at that point it's starting to decline, and another game has picked up its place. But, like, I think that's backwards. I think it's that because there was no long-term investment put in getting new players into the game, that as soon as your top players, who everybody knows, your household names, move on to something else, there's nobody to step up and take their place anymore, and it's done.
Right.
So, anyway, so we've talked a little bit about why a developer might want this esports scene, but let's take a look at Nintendo for a second. I think that their position, not only are we uniquely, positioned to talk about it from our experiences, but I think they are also an anomaly somewhat in regard to companies that have developed esports games.
Yeah.
They from the beginning have seemed very solidly focused on the casual market. I think that, the epitome of this is the Nintendo Wii and the Wii Sports era, I guess. This enormously high selling game, like absurd. They made so much money off of the Wii, and Wii Sports is, granted they were giving it away with the Wii, but that kind of sold the title. I mean, that's kind of sold the console.
Yeah.
That basically a tech demo is a game, and that game was not competitive in the slightest. That game was one of the most casual experiences of all time. You had grandmothers that were able to play this Wii bowling and enjoy it, and it got new people into video games as a whole. Like, that seems, from a business perspective, like the untapped market, rather than the elite esports games where you could talk about all of these different companies that are making all of these different titles that all have the same style of jersey, that all have a lot of the very oddly similar. I feel like the market is more saturated in terms of esports titles rather than titles that are designed to be multiplayer but casual.
I agree, but I think that on a personal level is frustrating to me. I think that part of me thinks that if you're not playing Melee, you are like, playing casual games is a coping mechanism for you not being good at Melee. Essentially. I think that I, in some place, have that perception of people. Like, and it could be Smash also. I just think that, like, this is the game of games. And you are not playing it because you are afraid to lose. And I can make you not afraid to lose if we have a conversation about it. And so I think part of me is like, you can reach into a casual audience and make them play a competitive game. But as a developer, obviously, you just can't do that. Right? Mm-hmm. But on a societal level, I think, like, if you're not playing competitive Smash, to me, it's that you're avoiding it because you are afraid to lose. There's no other reason why you shouldn't be playing this game where Mario can punch Pac-Man. There's no other reason that exists.
I have so many thoughts about that. Oh my god. Because I think something high level, something competitive, it is a very rewarding experience. It teaches you a lot about yourself. And for me, the draw to Melee has always been self-expression. It's always been that this is the game that gives me the most tools to move around that I have ever seen in any game.
Yeah.
This is the game that lets me do these crazy fake outs. This is the game that lets me basically bend the character on screen to my will. They are responsive to what my mind wants to make them do. It's not that way at first.
Yeah.
You do not get there after a short amount of time.
And to be fair to me, that is the number one complaint of people who are involved in a competitive game and have knowledge of competitive Melee but are not involved in the Melee community. They say it's too hard and I will never be able to master it. When in reality, all of this is here for you. There are so many resources. And a lot of times when people say that, I'm just like, okay, you're right, fine. You're right for thinking that. But they're not right.
I'm having this kind of a conversation in my own head right now, trying to learn Dota right now. Because I play League of Legends, okay? Except for a couple of champions that came out very recently and that I still have yet to quite grasp. Literally every champion in that game, I can tell you what their Q, W, E, and R do. Like,
yeah,
that's an insane amount of knowledge. There are over 100 of those characters. That, like, it's like having the entire move list of a Smash game memorized. But now I'm getting into Dota, and I'm like, oh god, I've got to learn all of this all over again.
Yeah, there is probably
an amount of that I want in my life.
There is probably a certain point. Maybe I'll make an exception for people who are like through college, right? For people who don't have expendable time that they could be using, who have to work like 40 hours a week or something. Maybe there's an exception that can be made for that.
Like, I think that there should be a game like that for everyone. I think that everyone deserves the experience to get that good at something. Maybe it's not a game. Maybe it's a creative endeavor. Maybe you don't want to be like necessarily as competitive, but some artistic expression. Maybe it's a different kind of game. Maybe you're playing chess. Maybe you're a Go player. Maybe you're, a race car driver. I don't know. I think that everyone should at least have a competitive. Is it competitive for me? Because to me, I said it was self-expression, and I just compared it to art. Is it just that everyone needs a creative outlet? Am I just saying that everyone needs a hobby?
That might be true. And there are so many options to pick. Like, I could accept the argument that, like, I don't want to play competitive Melee because I think that Dota is sick, and I would like to spend more energy on that.
And another thing I'm thinking is, like...
Yeah.
Does it need... Are those things not innately competitive? Like, in art, I mean, obviously, what you create is your own self, is your own expression. But also, if you're going to make it professionally, like, that's hard. That's cutthroat.
Yeah.
And everyone's always being so self-critical. Everyone's always being, like, the most magnificent artists that you know have probably looked at every single piece of work they've ever done and gone, oh, that's shit.
Yeah. It's like it's like the same impulse that makes someone drop out of film school and get like an economics degree or something, It's like I don't buy into myself enough to want to pursue this, which is understandable, I guess. But the opportunity cost is not very high for just going to a couple of tournaments a week. I'm telling you. You could do this, and you should do this for me as a personal favor, just to see if it's fun. If you're watching this out there.
Definitely. Like, if you enjoy video games, I think the experience of trying to take one a little bit more seriously, a little bit more competitively, is something that will teach you a lot about yourself, that will give you skills, coping mechanisms for real life. And it will make you feel cool. It will make you feel like a god, that you can make your inkling roll around the corner that way, that you can move your character across the screen that way, that you can hit that combo. Like, having the ability to control something precisely and consistently like that, that's a really empowering feeling. And that's something that I would want anyone to have, to feel like, at least in some arena, in some medium, I can do something that is really freaking cool.
And there's an interesting and maybe dangerous idea and I think we've talked about this before, Sleepy K, who made a video called "Why Do You Lie About Wanting to Be Good at Super Smash Bros. Melee for the Nintendo GameCube?" And his core thesis was that if you are a competitive player of a game, your ultimate goal should be to be the best player in the world at that game. Because if you get to a level where you can do a super cool thing, like, are you going to stop there?
Like, my answer to that is yes.
I think the answer is it could be yes also. Because I think that as long as you... Well, I think that your answer could be that you don't necessarily want to be good. But you want to, like, find something, right? You want to find something that makes you feel good or that brings you a connection with people. And you don't necessarily have to be in a competitive gaming community because you want to be good at the game either. You could be in it for a different reason. You could be in it because you want to see that community grow. And you could be in it because you want to bring other people into that experience to be friends with you, essentially.
There are definitely organizers who aren't really players of the game that much.
Yeah.
Like, I think of a notable example, Stephen Shackelford of SAK Gaming doesn't actually play Super Smash Brothers that often.
Yeah.
But he's more invested in the Smash community than anybody I've ever met.
Yeah. I think
I would go that far. Like, that is his livelihood, and those grinders are his family.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
And I think that's
a real family.
Yes. And I think that's why I say, like, maybe not necessarily, like, make your goal to be on an LCS team or make your goal to be a top 100 Melee player or any of that. The first step that anyone can take, and that I think is a good experience for anyone to have who is interested in video games, is to go to a tournament. Is to go. And the thing that makes me sad is that for some games, you can't really do that very easily. You can't have that. I want as many people as possible to have that experience. That's like why I do this. I want as many people as possible to have the experience of going to a tournament, to have the experience that was so positive for me. And that's the problem with esports, Geoff. That's the problem with that approach to things, is that they can't reach there. They won't reach there. But somebody has to. Because this is an experience that is worth nothing if it is not shared, in my opinion. Well, maybe for some people. For me, it's worth nothing if it's not shared. And so, I think that we need to share it with as many people as possible. Riot, hit my line. We'll make it happen. But that's my take on how to make your esports game last forever. You reach out to people in some way. I'm not saying that Riot has to go into your school gymnasium personally and organize a tournament there. I'm saying that Riot needs to reach out to you and say, "Hey, are you doing okay? What do you need from us?" You need more people at your school gymnasium? Yeah. There's a way for us to help with that.
And so a company who's taking that step to say, we want to create this experience for people, first of all, I mean, as a, if I'm the company owner and I'm able to create that, that feels fulfilling to me. That is something that I am willing to spend my money on. Do you think that a more cold, pragmatic perspective will see that and think that that is worthwhile? Or do you think that we are counting on a developer to decide that they want to do what they can to unlock the fullest human potential of their work?
I think that we're counting on them to make a long-term consideration, and that's it. And I don't think that's unreasonable. It might be for some companies. This will
pay off financially in the long term if they stick to it.
I think so. I think absolutely. There's no other way that you're going to fill an Overwatch League arena. There's no other way. It's a money pit otherwise. I'm sorry, Blizzard. But that's my opinion on it. It's a money pit if you don't build the sort of grassroots communities that sports have.
Mm-hmm.
Because minor league sports teams, face the same issues. Like they can't fill arenas. It's like, I don't know. It's hard. It's really hard.
Mm-hmm. And those sports had the opportunity to build up that following over the decades or even centuries that they've been around before they were ever monetized. So I think that's one thing they have going for them, that they were the games people were already playing.
Yes.
And the concern that I have in esports, the number one concern that I think everything comes back to, is that at the end of the day, a video game is a product.
Yes.
Nobody sells baseball per se. There are people who sell the equipment and the component parts and the organization and all of that for it and the production. But at the end of the day, the game of baseball is very open source. And it's only developed the way that it has because people have decided to play it that way. Whereas video games are coded by a specific team that expects to be compensated for their troubles. They expect to continue to be able to make money off it. And there is always new competition because a game developing studio needs to constantly be developing more games. So
I disagree. I'm saying that if you are serious in your venture capital meetings about making esports into football, you need to play it fast and loose like that. You need to play it fast and loose where people can use the game in a community way without restriction. And you need to be investing in those sorts of programs.
I worry that there will end up being so many games that are being invested in that way that, yes, the ones who do reach the top, the ones at the top of the esportsearning.net or whatever it is, those games will absolutely benefit from that kind of support. But I worry that the risk for the games that don't end up making it is just too catastrophic, and that a lot of dev studios go under from that kind of effort.
That's capitalism, baby. I would rather have the games that rise to the top than the developer studios that produce the games that don't. I'm sorry. I'm saying right now that I'm willing to risk it so that we can have a game rise to the top.
I think that is, obviously that's a very pro-consumer perspective to have on it. And I just wonder what a game developer would be saying if they were on the podcast here with us.
Yeah, and listen, I think it could be a game that exists now. I think it could be Rocket League. I see very little reason why Rocket League couldn't do something like this and be successful with it. Aside from the fact that you're counting on you're counting on yourself to be able to get people engaged. That's the big gamble here, I think. And that doesn't always work. But if it does, chef's kiss. So glorious. So glorious will the victory be. I'm telling you.
Yeah, I think there is definitely something to be said. If the developer, if the investor has the means to be doing this, I think there is something to be said for putting your all behind a project and trying to push it out regardless of early success, and just saying, I think this is good enough. I want the world to see this. I want this to become the next big thing. And putting it all out there. I think if you're willing to put that kind of love behind your project, even if it ends up not succeeding financially, that you're doing what's probably best for yourself, for your self-actualization, for your fulfillment. So,
yeah. All right.
I think there's something to be said for that.
We got to wrap this up here. It's been an hour and a half. So,
yep.
Yeah, I think it's hard. It's challenging, right? But I think there are ways to make it happen. And I think someday we're going to get there as the esports community. We're going to have a glorious moment where people just come together to play the game. Whatever the game is. Whatever the games are, you know?
Mm-hmm. I think if enough people are willing to go down with the ship, that the ship won't go down.
There you go. That's how it is. All right. So, what do we got going on here? Oh, if you're watching this before June 1st, we are running a giveaway. The giveaway is through Gleam. I'll post a link in the description of the YouTube video. You can type, if anyone's in Twitch chat right now, you can type !giveaway to check that out. We're going to be giving away a HyperX Cloud Stinger headset to one of you lovely folks who just does us a favor, throws us a follow on Twitter, something of that sort. There's a bunch of ways that you can earn entries, so check that out. I think the next couple of days we've got tournaments, so stay tuned to the Twitch channels for those. And aside from that, go to bravest.com as always. Follow us on Twitch. Follow us on Twitter. Everything's Bravest Esports. And that's about it for this week, I think.
Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Appreciate the support.
Yep.
Watching or listening, I suppose, because this is a podcast.
We're podcasters now. Can you believe it? All right.
We've ascended. Right?
Yes. Yeah, to the pantheon. All right. We'll see you next time.
See you, everybody.